in our Shabbos. In January 1851, Abraham Lincoln received, this is well before he was president, obviously, he received a letter from his stepbrother John informing him that his father, Thomas Lincoln, was very ill and likely on his deathbed. Lincoln, dealing with illness in his own household, explained in his response that he was unable to visit his father at that time and that all manners of comfort should be provided to his father in his final hours. However, in the closing paragraph of the letter to his brother, Lincoln hinted that there may be another factor affecting his decision not to spend time with his father at his bedside in his last moments. He wrote, "Say to father that if we could meet now, it is doubtful whether it would not be more painful than pleasant." His reference to spending time with his father as more painful than pleasant is understood by some to indicate that Lincoln experienced with his father what many families unfortunately have with each other throughout history, which is estrangement. In the opening lines of his book, Fault Lines, Fractured Families, and How to Mend Them, Dr. Carl Pilmer of Cornell points out that estrangement can happen even in families where you might not have predicted, we might least expect it. Moreover, looking at families that are already estranged, it is impossible to predict during the estrangement which of them will find a way to reconcile in the future. He discusses the example of Christopher Robin Milne and his father, A. Milne, the creator of the Winnie the Pooh book series upon which the Disney films are loosely based. Father and son Milne were very close when Christopher Robin was a child and as a young adult, and he actually enjoyed the fact that he and his toys were the subjects of his father's books and poetry. But for a variety of reasons, the relationship between Christopher Robin Milne and his father began to fall apart when he reached adulthood. After his father died, Christopher Robin Milne became estranged from his mother as well. He wrote a memoir describing his early life and began to look at his relationship with his father in a much more negative light. He wrote, "He got where he was climbing on my infant shoulders, and he filched from me my good name, and he left me with nothing but the empty fame of being his son." Ultimately, his mother refused to see him on her deathbed, and there was no reconciliation. The sources of family estrangement, writes Pilmer, are diverse. It can be caused by memories of negative childhood experiences, by parents' divorce, by a child's choice of partner, by money and inheritance disputes, by unmet expectations of support of gratitude or success, or by large differences in values and lifestyle. Whatever the cause, it can be very difficult to repair relationships once they are broken, and separation happens over a long period of time. If there's anything that defines Parshat Lecha, any theme that runs throughout it, it is arguably the experience of family estrangement. The first of the people in our story to separate from their family, from their parents and siblings, and to go on their own way are Avram, Sarah, and Lot. God directly instructs Abraham too, for his own sake, Lech Lecha, to leave his homeland, his birthplace, his family, and to head out into the wilderness, into the unknown, not knowing his ultimate destination. And put this way, Hashem's instruction was less for Avram to travel to Canaan, to get to Canaan, than for Avram to leave, to abandon his family, his people, and his way of life. He was instructed, he was told, directed to choose estrangement. Midrash explains that Avram initially did create friction with his father Terach by destroying his father's idols and denying their divinity, leading Terach to turn Avram into the king, Nimrod. But after Avram was miraculously saved from death and survived being thrown in a fiery furnace, the Zohar says that Terach changed his mind, repented, and implies that he reestablished his relationship with his son, which is why Avram followed him back from Ur Kasdim to Haran. And so, if that's the case, the instruction by God for Abraham to continue on to Canaan without his father was an explicit command for Abraham to self-estrange himself from his family, to do what we could call artificial family estrangement. But it does not take long for the family of Abram's, for the part of Abram's family that follows him to Canaan to fracture and to break apart organically as well. When Abram first leaves for Canaan, the Torah emphasizes on multiple occasions that Lot, his nephew, comes with him. Abram went as Hashem spoke to him. Lot went with him. And a little bit later it says, Abram took Sarai, his wife, ve'et Lot ben Achiv, and also Lot, the son of his brother. In other words, the Torah makes it sound as if Lot chooses to go with Abram voluntarily, and that he is second only to Abram's wife, Sarai, among the people in Abram's life. Lot is not being dragged on a journey that he does not want to take. He believes his uncle and believes in him, trusts him to take them away from their family and friends, from their familiar place, to an undisclosed new location. One could not imagine a deeper level of closeness and trust between uncle and nephew than that. However, when they arrive in Canaan, which God announces to be their new home, things do not initially go so well. It's not so easy for them. They are almost immediately faced with the difficult choice to travel to Egypt to escape a famine in Canaan, and Sarah, who is both Abram's wife and Lot's sister, is taken by the Pharaoh for his own purposes. They are lavish with Abram and Lot are lavish with riches and experience a very different culture from the nomadic, modest, rugged, and idealistic life that they had lived until that point. And Rav Soloveitchik and Professor Nechama Leibowitz both independently suggest that it is at that point in Egypt that Lot's and Avram's paths begin to diverge. God punishes Egypt for their treatment of Sarah, and she is released. And Avram and his family are given even more riches by the Egyptian king and expelled from Egypt back to Canaan. Lot does follow his uncle this time to Canaan, but the Torah hints that things have changed since they first got there. Avram went up from Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had. Right? And Lot was also with him, and they went to the south. Avram had all the stuff. He had cattle and silver and gold. But God the Lot had Avram. Oh yeah, and also Lot had a lot of stuff. Who went with Avram had a lot of stuff. Right? The Torah in these verses separates Lot from Avram as if to say, oh yeah, and Lot was with him too. And he had lots of stuff too. He was there, but not necessarily identifying as part of the same group, the same community. This distance is perhaps what leads to a dispute between the shepherds that work for each of them. The land couldn't even satisfy, couldn't hold them living together because they had a lot of stuff. They couldn't live together. And there was a fight going on between the shepherds of the cattle of Aram and the shepherds of the cattle of Lot, and the Canaanites and the Perizzites also were living in the land at that time. Professor Leibowitz points out that the commentators debate the basis of the fight between the shepherds. What were they fighting about? Ramban says that the dispute was political and economic in nature. The presence of the Canaanites and the Perizzites creates the potential for tension because these other people might notice that Avram and Lot have a vast wealth, demonstrated to them by the fact that they didn't have enough pasture land for both of their herds. And if so, Avram's suggestion that they separate and Lot's decision to move to Sodom are entirely for practical reasons. Their estrangement was not necessarily a matter of a gap in values or personal disagreement. It was a financial and political dispute. But Rashi quotes the Midrash with a different take on the separation between uncle and nephew. The shepherd's dispute is about whether it was permitted for their cattle to graze on property that they did not purchase, that belonged at that point still to the Canaanites and the Perizzites. Lot's shepherds argue that since God promised the land to Abram, and Abram has no children, the land inevitably is going to be inherited by Lot, and so why shouldn't Lot be allowed to graze his animals on pasture that will most certainly be his anyway in the near future? And Avram's shepherds, in contrast, point out that until Avram's descendants are actually given the land by God, it belongs to the people who live there, to the Canaanites and the Perizzites. It is theft for them to graze on the land that doesn't belong to them right now. Now, this is not just a legal dispute about whether future inherited land is already considered inherited. It is an argument about values, about the obligation of humans to stand up for justice and righteousness, to do the right thing in the moment, rather than to just use one's relationship with God or one's privilege to take advantage of others. What Lot observes in close proximity to Egypt's royalty is that wealth and comfort and pleasure are achievable without sacrifice and hard work, and that performing justice does not protect you from the harsh realities of the world. Abraham, despite the challenges he faces before and while living in Egypt and the wealth that he accumulates on his way out of Egypt, Abraham does not let those things affect his worldview. Lot did, however, and that is why the Torah says that they could not remain together. They could not live together. They were becoming estranged over values, not just money and practical concerns. So, what is Avram's response to this estrangement? Does he try to stop it? Does he encourage it? How does he handle it? The Torah tells us that Avram said the following to his nephew. Avram said to Lot, there shouldn't be a fight between me and you, between my shepherds and your shepherds. We're people that are brothers. The whole land is in front of you. So you separate from me. You go to the left, I'll go to the right. You go to the right, I'll go to the left. The Pshat reading of what happened, as Radak explains, is that Avram is choosing to actually separate himself from his nephew, that they are going to be estranged from one another. They're choosing family estrangement. Their differences cannot be overcome, and they must head their separate ways. But Rashi explains that Avram had something else in mind. If you go left, I will go right does not mean that if Lot goes one direction, Avram will go the opposite way. It means that Avram will stand by him wherever Lot goes, just a short distance away, to Lot's immediate left or to Lot's immediate right, in protection of him. Even though they are not on the same page, Lot and Avram, Avram does not want to separate totally. He wants to continue the relationship and to work on it. As he puts it, for we are brothers. Unfortunately, Lot does not understand Avram's intent or decides that separating completely is a better idea. And he sees that Sodom is Kegan Hashem Eretz Yisrael. It's to him like the Garden of Hashem, the Garden of Eden, and like the land of Egypt. He sees a place that matches his values and matches his desire for wealth and comfort, and he abandons Avram and his family. Avram, however, does not immediately give up. As soon as he hears that his nephew is taken captive in a war, Avram gears up for battle and leads his men to victory, freeing Lot. Avram, when he hears that his brother has been taken captive, he gears up and he takes 318 people with him and he chases them all the way to Dan. And he returns all of the property that was taken and also Lot, his brother. Twice during Avram's involvement in the war, the Torah refers to Lot as Avram's brother. Clearly, Avram is still invested in the relationship. However, when Lot goes back to Sodom again, Avram doesn't try to stop it. And when the Rebbeinu Shalom, God, tells Avram that Sodom is to be destroyed for its wickedness, Avram does not suit up again to physically save Lot from disaster. The Midrash in Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer says, when Avram prays for God not to destroy the city, arguing that God shouldn't kill the innocent with the guilty, what he had in mind, the innocent people he had in mind, was Lot and Lot's family. Avram is hoping that Lot remains innocent enough to deserve to be saved. But when God tells him that there aren't even 10 innocent people there, Avram gives up hope. The estrangement appears to be complete and final. But there's one more story of estrangement in the Parsha that goes a different direction. After instructing Avram to consort with her handmaid Hagar so that he can have a child, Sarah twice drives Hagar from her home because of that very same child. The first estrangement takes place while Hagar is still pregnant, before Ishmael is born. But the second time is after the birth of Yitzchak, more than 13 years later, when Ishmael is already a teenager. And certainly Ishmael would remember, at that age, being rejected and exiled from his home. He'd remember throughout his life. It probably would scar him, separate him from his father, and one would assume that reconciliation between him and his father would be even less likely between Avram and Lot. And yet the Torah hints several times that, in fact, Avram and Yishmael on some level do reconcile. The Talmud and Midrash point out that the Torah says that Avram was blessed bakol with everything. It emphasizes that Avram is buried by Yitzchak and Yishmael together, and Yishmael should be known as Ben Abraham, the son of Avram. And the rabbis understand from these verses that Ishmael asat tshuva. Ishmael repented. He returned to being part of Avram's family, though his descendants did not necessarily maintain that connection. These stories support Dr. Pelhamer's research that estrangement can be caused by fights large and small. They can be based on religious journeys, financial disputes, political tension, family feuds, and changes in value systems. The fact that Lot and Ishmael's relationships with Avram's family end so differently also shows that it is nearly impossible to predict which estrangement will end in reconciliation. Is there any evidence for how reconciliation can be successfully achieved when possible? Pelhamer cites some of the people who did reconcile after long family estrangements as offering several strategies. One is to accept that the two sides will not be able to see their initial disagreement from the same point of view. Blame may belong more to one side than the other, but each side will just have to accept that they will not be able to convince the other to agree with their perspective on what happened. Second, people in a family estrangement situation need to lower expectations for what they want from the other person. This prevents the fighting from restarting when the behavior repeats or when when the other person continues to have beliefs that made them upset in the first place. And finally, there is a need when trying to bridge the gap of reconciliation to create boundaries, clarification of what can be said or done in each other's presence, and define limits for how much time and space they have for each other in one another's lives. During this election season, many families are experiencing high levels of tension and disagreement. Our community, our country, perhaps even our world, has become more polarized with respect to the weighing of different values and priorities, and identity has become a more central component in defining our political opinions, making it hurtful when our family or friends support different politicians, parties, or policies than we do. This is a recipe for estrangement. And as we can see, once families do break apart, once those fault lines are created, it can be very hard to bridge over the fault, to put the families back together. So we need to do everything we can, no matter how deep the disagreement, to avoid a Lot or Ishmael situation. Using some of the aforementioned strategies for reconciliation, we can use those strategies preemptively. Maybe that'll help. There's no guarantee of success, but we have to do our best to find common ground with our parents, siblings, children, friends, and neighbors to create space where we can respect each other despite deep and sometimes painful to think about disagreements. No matter who wins on November 3rd or in the days following, there will be those of us who are deeply distraught by the results. Rather than push each other away, let's do our best to have empathy for people who think and feel differently from ourselves, especially the people we love, and to find a way to move forward together as families, as a community, and as a nation. I want to wish you a safe and enjoyable Shabbat.